The program we have today is sponsored by a Nestle food company, and it tries to do one thing in three parts. We've asked three different people from three different sectors, from what's called humanitarian, from what is economics or agricultural economics, and from industry, to address from their own particular point of view with some generalization toward a larger sector-wide focus, three questions. First, how did their company or their sector, first become aware of the current global crisis? Second of all, what steps were taken for analysis, for assessment of that? And thirdly, what actions have been taken or could be taken, should be taken, in order to address it? Of course, the larger notion mentioned all during the morning is partnership, interaction. And so when we have our discussion here, we'll be finding ways that each of these visions, whether they be common or disparate, can be harmonized and synergized with regard to the actions going forward. We have three speakers. The second speaker will be a speaker, but she'll be presenting the work of one of our invitees who was unable to make it. But I'll give my first introduction to Professor Patrick Webb of the Friedman School of Nutrition and Policy. He's the Associate Dean of that school, has a distinguished and long career in varied aspects of both humanitarian and academia. That's his preferred choice of his field. So we'll let Patrick go ahead.
Okay.
Thank you, Patrick.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Please keep eating. That could almost be the title for this session. As you saw, there was almost a slight food crisis outside a few moments ago, not driven necessarily by constraints to the supply of the number of lunch boxes, but certainly to the perception, potentially, that demand would outstrip supply, and uncertainty over whether or not oneself would actually get access to the supply that was available. I'm going to reframe the three questions that Noel just laid out just a little bit. And in so doing, I think this needs to come down a bit, set the scene, set some of the framework for the subsequent speakers. And I'll have to go quite quickly because of the short nature of this particular session, but I'm going to start with a quote from President Roosevelt during the last major global recession. And I think it's important because I think to paraphrase that particular quote, to some extent is a good reflection of the crisis we've just been through and continue to go through, in the sense that what it is not, we should be worried about is not just the impact of particular shocks, but how others react or do not react in the context of those shocks, and how that affects us. So I'm going to be using actually a series of timelines. I borrowed this from Derek Heddy at IFPRI, just to give the overview of the nominal price rise and then fall over the recent decade of the four major exported crops as well as petroleum. Now, what we measure matters a great deal. So information is very important. The question was, where do we get information? How do we get it? What we measure matters to our response. And it's very important just to start by reminding that just a couple of years ago, the world was being alerted to the threat to global food security of declining agricultural commodity prices. It was the downward trend and the collapse in prices that was causing a threat to global food security. A couple of very short years later, the exact opposite is being framed as the threat to global food security. Now, of course, How can that be? One can immediately ask. And is it really either or? And the answer is no, it's not. It depends who we're talking about and where we're talking about, whether we are a producer or a consumer, whether we are engaged in the global trade arena or not. So information asymmetry, information reflected in prices, is not communicated uniformly or equitably around the world, and that's an important point to bear in mind. Regarding the price rise, when it came very abruptly. The Food Outlook, put out by FAO in June of 2007, was reporting record global harvests, so not about a global collapse in supply, but global record harvests, and prices, albeit remaining high, weaker than they had been the year before. And only a few months later was the report that prices were soaring. So there was not, as of middle of 2007, any early warning about the prices. Quite the contrary, one could argue there was a little bit of dampening of expectation. Why? Well, we're talking about data on global level food supply. And food supply data come in somewhat late. They are backward looking. Supply did not collapse globally. That was not a driver of the price hikes, one of the unusual manifestations of this crisis. But beyond that, we lack information globally as well as locally on access to food, how people are obtaining food, are they obtaining food, what food they're obtaining. So this begs the question of, are we monitoring the right kinds of information to be able to tailor appropriate responses? When food prices started to soar, the connectivity among multiple commodities was already in place. But some of the early manifestations of something going wrong with the system were, of course, the riots. Now, I won't even call them food riots, because sometimes it's not easy at any time to say this is a food riot, because the fuel prices were having a role to play in many cases. One of the first, one of the early ones was in Mexico, when the price of tortillas leapt up, and as you can see, it was just when the price of maize had leapt up in a variety of countries. Shortly after that, West Bengal, we had riots in the context of rice price increases, and shortly after that it started spreading, and then it carried on spreading around the world to the point where up here we were having about 20 a month in different parts of the world, and it almost mirrors now then the decline in manifestations against the price rises, be they the cost of fuel, the cost of healthcare, the cost of school uniforms, and so on, all of which were linked in various ways. Now, media alarm, they were early on the scene when it came to the connectivity issue. It was very early that the media were picking up the potential relationship between biofuels and food supply because of the large amount of maize being converted in the US and elsewhere into fuel. And that was at a time when price of fuel was rising quite steeply before it then came down. It wasn't, however, until a little bit later that we started seeing other things coming along. Okay, investments in the market, the futures markets, the hedge funds getting involved. This came quite early, long before the Food Outlook, the FAO report, was saying that there could be a problem. The markets were already recognizing that there could be a problem down the road because of hedging and futures. It really wasn't until October, November that the media took this on as a global and food-related crisis. And from then on, as the prices continued to rise, there were more and more reports of global hunger on the increase and the potential dangerous effects on the world economy. The UN and other humanitarian organizations, they were alerted by some of the riots, but they were also somewhat, I won't say slow, but the first analogy